It was a bright morning at the airport, and the terminal was buzzing with people. Travelers hurried past with their suitcases. Parents guided children through the crowds, and announcements echoed over the speakers, calling passengers to their gates. Among the crowd, a black woman named Amina moved with quiet confidence. She had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. It was not just any flight. It was a chance to visit her family, reconnect with loved ones, and take a short break from her busy life. She carried a small carry-on bag, neatly packed with essentials, and her laptop bag slung over her shoulder. Her calm presence contrasted with the rush around her. Amina arrived at the gate a little early. She found a quiet spot to sit and wait for boarding, observing the crowd around her. Families with small children were scattered throughout the seating area. Some children ran around excitedly, while others sat quietly beside their parents reading books or playing with toys. The air smelled faintly of coffee and pastries from the nearby cafe, and the soft hum of rolling suitcases created a rhythm that blended with the announcements. Amina liked this part of traveling, the moment before boarding when the world felt like it was paused and everyone had a small space to think about their journey ahead. Soon, the boarding call began. Passengers lined up by zones, showing their boarding passes to the attendants. Amina joined the line for her zone, her ticket ready, her seat confirmed. She glanced at her boarding pass, seat 12A, a window seat she had chosen carefully. She enjoyed looking out the window during flights, watching clouds shift and cities shrink below. This seat was important to her. It was her personal space for reflection and comfort during the hours in the air. As she walked down the jet bridge and entered the plane, she felt the familiar mix of excitement and calm. The cabin was already partially filled with passengers. People were stowing their luggage in the overhead bins, adjusting their seats and preparing for the journey ahead. Amina moved to her seat, smiled politely at the people nearby, and began placing her bag in the overhead compartment. The window seat was perfect. She settled in, fastened her seatbelt, and took a moment to look around. Across the aisle, a mother with a young child was trying to organize her things. The child squirmed, clearly restless, tugging at toys and looking around the cabin with curiosity. The mother's focus was on managing her child while also keeping an eye on her boarding pass. As the flight attendants walked down the aisle, helping passengers find their seats and stowing luggage, Amina noticed the mother glance toward her window seat. At first, she didn't think much of it. But then the mother walked closer, leaning slightly toward Amina. "Excuse me," the mother said, her voice polite but with a hint of insistence. "Would you mind if my child sat by the window? He's been looking forward to it all morning." Amina looked at the child, who smiled shyly. She understood the mother's request and the desire for a child to have a special experience, but she also knew that this was her seat and she had paid for it. She responded calmly, her tone gentle yet firm. "I'm sorry, but this is my seat. I booked it carefully and I really want to keep it." The mother hesitated for a moment, then smiled nervously. "Oh, I see. I didn't realize. It's just that he's been very excited about sitting by the window. And I thought maybe—" She trailed off, unsure how to continue without seeming demanding. Amina could feel the tension growing, though she stayed composed. She understood that parents often wanted the best for their children, and she respected that, but she also believed in fairness and the importance of standing up for herself. She tried to maintain a polite demeanor, making sure not to escalate the situation unnecessarily. "I understand completely," she said softly. "I hope he gets another window seat on a future flight." The mother's expression shifted slightly, from polite understanding to quiet frustration. She glanced at her child, then back at Amina. "But this is the window seat and it would make him so happy. Couldn't you just switch?" Amina shook her head gently. "I'm afraid not. I really need to stay in my seat. I hope you understand." For a moment, the mother looked around, perhaps hoping for support from the nearby passengers. A few people glanced over, curious about the exchange. Some whispered quietly to each other. Others pretended not to notice, absorbed in their own preparations. The cabin, though busy, seemed to hold its breath. The child tugged lightly at his mother's hand, sensing her frustration. His eyes darted toward the window and then back at Amina. Amina offered him a warm smile, trying to ease the situation. "I know it's exciting to sit by the window," she said kindly. "I remember feeling the same way as a child." The mother sighed softly. "I just thought maybe—" She stopped, unsure how to proceed without creating conflict. Amina remained calm. She had been in situations before where people tried to pressure her, but she had learned that the best approach was to stay composed and respectful. She adjusted her seat slightly, making herself comfortable but kept her gaze kind and steady. She didn't want to make the child or the mother feel worse, but she also wasn't willing to give up her space. Nearby, the flight attendants were finishing preparations for takeoff. They moved efficiently through the aisle, checking seatbelts, assisting passengers, and ensuring everything was in order. One flight attendant, noticing the tension between Amina and the mother, paused to observe. The attendant had seen similar situations before and knew that a calm approach often prevented conflict from escalating. The mother finally spoke again, her tone a mixture of insistence and uncertainty. "Are you sure you can't move? It would really mean a lot to him." Amina nodded firmly. "I'm sure. I hope you understand. I booked this seat for myself and I can't give it up." The child's face fell slightly, but he didn't protest. He looked to his mother for guidance, sensing her emotions. The mother took a deep breath, realizing that the situation might not be resolved the way she had hoped. She looked around, noticing the passengers who were now subtly paying attention, and perhaps feeling a little self-conscious about her persistence. As the plane's engines started to hum in the background, signaling that takeoff was approaching, the mother reluctantly gave up. She straightened her posture, adjusted her child in his own seat, and muttered a quiet acknowledgement of Amina's decision. Amina smiled politely, relieved that the situation had not escalated further. She returned to looking out the window, enjoying the clouds beginning to form patterns across the sky. The cabin began to settle. Passengers read, listened to music, or watched the scenery outside. Amina felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, knowing she had handled the situation calmly and respectfully. She reflected on how sometimes standing up for oneself doesn't require anger or confrontation, just patience, kindness, and confidence. Even as the plane prepared for takeoff, the memory of the encounter stayed with her. She understood the challenges parents face when traveling, but she also recognized the importance of boundaries and fairness. She felt a quiet pride in maintaining her space and dignity, while also showing empathy toward the child. The engines roared to life, the plane slowly moving toward the runway. Amina fastened her seatbelt more securely and watched the ground move beneath her. The mother beside her focused on calming her child, who now seemed content with the view from his own seat. Amina knew the flight would be long, but this moment had already taught her something valuable about patience, courage, and respect in everyday situations. As the plane lifted into the sky, the city below shrinking into a patchwork of buildings and roads, Amina leaned back in her seat. She felt the gentle sway of the aircraft and the quiet hum of fellow travelers settling in for the journey. She knew that moments like these, small and seemingly ordinary, often carried the most important lessons, and so, with the clouds passing by outside her window, Amina began her journey, carrying not just her luggage, but also a renewed sense of self-respect, calm confidence, and the quiet understanding that fairness and kindness can coexist, even in the most tense of situations. After the plane lifted into the sky, the cabin gradually settled into a quiet rhythm. Passengers read, listened to music, or gazed out the window as the city below turned into a distant pattern of buildings and streets. Amina leaned back in her seat, still feeling the gentle vibration of the aircraft. She had hoped that the earlier tension with the mother and her child would fade into the background, but she could sense that the mother was still frustrated. Amina remained calm, determined not to let the situation affect her peace of mind. The mother adjusted her seat, tugging slightly at her child's jacket and trying to keep him entertained. The child, though initially disappointed, began to engage with a small toy, occasionally glancing toward Amina's window with curiosity. Amina offered a small smile each time, silently reassuring him that everything was okay. She understood that children often felt the disappointment of a denied request more sharply than adults, and she wanted to make the child feel at ease without giving up her seat. As the flight attendants moved down the aisle to perform their safety checks, one of them, a young woman named Clara, noticed the subtle tension lingering between Amina and the mother. Clara had been working as a flight attendant for several years and had learned to read situations quickly. She recognized that some conflicts, if left unchecked, could escalate into uncomfortable experiences for both passengers and staff. Clara paused briefly near Amina's row, observing quietly while continuing to check seatbelts and overhead compartments. The mother glanced at Clara, perhaps hoping for support or validation. "Excuse me," she said, trying to sound polite but with an underlying insistence. "Could my child possibly sit by the window? He's been very excited about it." Her voice carried a tone of gentle pleading, but it was clear that she wanted a yes rather than a no. Amina looked at Clara, and then back at the mother, maintaining her calm demeanor. "I'm sorry, but this is my seat," she said softly. "I really need to stay here. I hope you understand." Her voice was steady, polite, yet firm. It carried the quiet strength of someone who knew her rights and wasn't afraid to uphold them. The mother hesitated, clearly frustrated by the refusal. She glanced at her child, who now seemed to sense the tension in the air. The child tugged lightly at her sleeve, giving a small frown, as if asking why the woman wouldn't move. The mother's expression softened for a moment, acknowledging her child's disappointment, but then her insistence returned. "I understand, but it would really mean a lot to him," she said. "Couldn't you just switch for this one time?" Amina shook her head gently, her tone remaining calm. "I'm afraid I can't. I booked this seat for myself. I hope he can enjoy another window seat in the future." Her words were measured, showing empathy without yielding. She wanted to communicate that fairness applied to everyone, and that her rights as a passenger were just as valid as the mother's wishes for her child. The mother's frustration became more noticeable. She shifted in her seat, sighing softly, and looked around the cabin, perhaps seeking support from nearby passengers. A few people glanced over, their expressions curious but neutral. Some whispered quietly to each other, discussing the situation, while others pretended not to notice, absorbed in their own activities. The atmosphere was quiet, but the tension was palpable. The child continued to fidget, occasionally glancing toward Amina's window seat with longing. Amina noticed and smiled gently, hoping to ease his disappointment. "I remember feeling the same way as a child," she said softly. "Sometimes we want something very much, but it's not always possible. I know it's hard, but I promise you'll enjoy the flight anyway." The mother looked at Amina, torn between frustration and gratitude. She wanted her child to be happy, but she also recognized the woman's polite firmness. She glanced at the flight attendant, Clara, hoping that perhaps she could help mediate the situation. Clara, attentive and calm, approached the row with a professional yet friendly demeanor. "Hello," Clara said warmly. "I noticed there's a little disagreement here. Could we take a moment to talk about it?" Her tone was neutral, respectful, and designed to de-escalate the situation. She addressed both Amina and the mother, making it clear that she wanted to understand both perspectives. The mother spoke first, her voice polite but tinged with frustration. "I was hoping my child could sit by the window. He's very excited, and I thought maybe the woman here could move just this once." She gestured toward Amina, who continued to sit calmly in her seat. Amina replied, maintaining her composure. "I understand completely, but this is my seat. I booked it for myself, and I really need to stay here. I hope he can enjoy another window seat sometime soon." Her tone was gentle but unwavering, showing that she was firm in her decision while still being empathetic toward the child. Clara nodded, listening carefully to both sides. "Thank you for explaining," she said. "I understand that you want your child to be happy, and I also understand that you have your own seat and plans. In situations like this, we follow airline policy, which is that each passenger keeps their assigned seat. I know it's disappointing, but we have to respect the seating arrangements." The mother's expression shifted. She had not expected a flight attendant to take this clear stance so quickly. She glanced at her child, who seemed to sense the change in energy. The child's frown softened, and he returned to playing quietly with his toy. The mother muttered a soft, reluctant acknowledgement, realizing that she would not get her way. Passengers nearby seemed to relax as well. Some smiled discreetly at Amina, offering silent support. Others returned to their reading or music, glad that the situation was being handled professionally. Clara gave a reassuring nod to both women and continued down the aisle, ensuring that everyone felt comfortable and respected. Amina felt a wave of relief. She had remained calm, polite, and firm, and the support of the flight attendant reinforced her confidence. She leaned back in her seat, enjoying the view outside the window. The clouds stretched endlessly, soft and white, creating patterns against the bright blue sky. She took a deep breath, letting the gentle hum of the aircraft soothe her. The mother, though still slightly frustrated, focused on her child. She adjusted the child's seatbelt and handed him a small snack, trying to make the experience enjoyable despite the disappointment. The child smiled faintly, clearly comforted by his mother's attention. Amina continued to smile softly at him, offering a sense of calm without further words. As the flight progressed, the atmosphere in the cabin became more relaxed. Passengers settled into their routines. Some read books, others watched movies, and some simply gazed out the window. Amina reflected on the incident and felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had handled the situation without anger, without confrontation, and without giving up her own rights. She realized that sometimes standing firm required patience, empathy, and clear communication. The mother occasionally glanced toward Amina, perhaps reflecting on the lesson she had just learned. She understood that insisting on her own desires at the expense of another person's rights was not fair. The child, meanwhile, seemed content, absorbed in his toy and now curious about the view outside. Amina's calm presence had helped prevent the situation from escalating further, and the mother's acknowledgement of her own behavior created a small but important moment of growth. As the flight continued, Amina looked around the cabin and noticed the subtle changes in the atmosphere. Passengers seemed more at ease, some exchanging quiet smiles or nods of understanding. The tension that had briefly hung in the air had dissipated, replaced by a sense of respect for boundaries and fairness. Amina felt grateful for the professionalism of the flight attendant, who had ensured that everyone understood the rules and that the situation was handled smoothly. By the time the in-flight service began, the mother and her child had settled fully into their seats. The child occasionally looked out the window, fascinated by the clouds and the distant landscape. Amina returned her attention to her own experience, enjoying the peace that came from standing up for herself in a calm and respectful way. She knew that this small incident, though seemingly minor, carried an important lesson about fairness, patience, and the courage to assert one's rights. Throughout the remainder of the flight, Amina reflected on the experience. She thought about how everyday situations often required quiet strength and empathy, and how small actions could have a big impact on others. She realized that handling conflicts gracefully did not mean compromising her own needs. It meant communicating clearly, remaining composed, and respecting the perspectives of others. By the time the plane began its descent, the mother and her child seemed fully content. Amina had maintained her peace of mind and learned an important lesson about human behavior and personal boundaries. She felt proud of herself for remaining calm and respectful, and she knew that this experience would stay with her for a long time. As the city below came into view once more, Amina smiled softly. She had faced a challenging moment with patience and grace, and she had emerged with her dignity intact. The lesson of fairness, empathy, and calm assertiveness was one she would carry forward not just on flights, but in many areas of life. As the plane leveled off and the steady hum of the engines filled the cabin, the atmosphere seemed calm. Most passengers had settled into their routines, whether reading, listening to music, or watching movies on their screens. Yet a quiet tension lingered near Amina's seat. The mother, still slightly frustrated, could not fully hide her disappointment. Her child, now occupied with a toy, occasionally glanced at the window with longing, tugging lightly at his mother's sleeve. Amina noticed this, but she remained composed, focusing on her own space and comfort. It seemed that the mother was trying to gather courage for another attempt. She straightened in her seat, took a deep breath, and leaned slightly toward Amina. "Are you sure you really can't switch seats?" she asked, her voice now a little firmer. There was a sense of insistence, a belief that perhaps politeness could eventually wear down Amina's resolve. She had grown accustomed to receiving concessions from others and assumed this situation might be the same. Amina looked at her, maintaining her calm and steady gaze. "I'm sure," she replied, her tone gentle but resolute. "This is my seat and I need to stay here. I hope your child can enjoy another window seat sometime soon." Her words were measured and polite, yet carried the quiet authority of someone who knew her rights and was unwilling to be pressured. The mother's frustration became more noticeable. She fidgeted in her seat, tugged slightly at her child's sleeve, and glanced around as if hoping for support from nearby passengers. A few people did look over, curious about the exchange, but none intervened. The cabin remained calm overall, though a few whispers and curious glances drifted through the air, giving the impression that everyone sensed something was happening. The child, sensing his mother's growing frustration, began to frown slightly and tugged at her sleeve again. He looked at Amina, perhaps wondering why the woman wouldn't move. Amina smiled gently at him, hoping to ease his disappointment without saying more. She understood that children often felt these emotions intensely and wanted to offer reassurance through kindness rather than confrontation. At that moment, Clara, the flight attendant, noticed the mother's repeated attempts and the child's visible disappointment. Clara had learned through experience that unresolved tension, even when subtle, could escalate quickly. She approached the row with a calm and professional demeanor, ensuring her presence was non-threatening but attentive. "Hello?" Clara said warmly. "I see there's a little discussion going on here. Can we talk for a moment?" Her voice was neutral and respectful, designed to de-escalate the situation rather than take sides immediately. The mother looked at Clara, hopeful that the flight attendant might intervene in her favor. "I was hoping my child could sit by the window," she said. "He's very excited, and I thought maybe the woman here could move just this once." Her voice carried a mix of insistence and polite pleading. Amina responded calmly, keeping her composure. "I understand completely, but this is my seat. I booked it for myself, and I need to stay here. I hope your child can enjoy another window seat in the future." Her tone remained gentle, emphasizing empathy for the child while standing firm on her rights. Clara listened carefully to both sides, nodding as she processed the situation. She knew that flight attendants often had to manage these delicate interactions with patience and fairness. "I understand that you want your child to be happy," she said, addressing the mother. "And I also understand that you have your own seat and your own plans. The airline policy is that passengers keep their assigned seats. Everyone has the right to their own seat, including this passenger." Her tone was firm yet polite, leaving no room for misunderstanding. The mother's face registered surprise. She had expected that perhaps a slight complaint or insistence might persuade someone to change seats. Instead, she was met with clear support for Amina's right to remain in her seat. She glanced at her child, who seemed uncertain but began to focus on his toy again. The mother sighed softly, realizing that her attempts to persuade would not succeed. The cabin seemed to relax slightly as Clara continued down the aisle, ensuring that the situation was under control. Some passengers smiled discreetly at Amina, offering silent support for her composure and fairness. Others returned to their activities, reassured that the issue had been addressed professionally. Amina leaned back in her seat, feeling a quiet sense of relief. She had handled the situation with patience and calmness, and the support of the flight attendant reinforced her confidence. The mother continued to glance at Amina occasionally, a mix of frustration and reflection on her face. She adjusted her child in his seat and handed him a snack, trying to make the experience pleasant despite her disappointment. The child smiled faintly, comforted by his mother's attention and the small distraction of the snack. Amina's calm presence, paired with Clara's intervention, had prevented the situation from escalating further. As the flight progressed, the atmosphere in the cabin improved. Passengers settled into routines, reading, watching movies, or enjoying the view outside. The earlier tension had left its mark, but it was now replaced by a quiet sense of respect and understanding. Amina reflected on the incident, recognizing the importance of maintaining calm in the face of pressure. She understood that asserting one's rights did not require confrontation or anger. It required patience, clarity, and empathy. The mother, though still slightly frustrated, focused on her child. She understood that the window seat was not the most important thing, and she began to accept the reality of the situation. The child, who had been watching Amina with curiosity, now seemed content with the toy and the view from his own seat. Amina continued to smile gently at him occasionally, offering reassurance through her calm demeanor. Clara, having ensured that both parties understood the rules and felt respected, moved on to attend to other passengers. She knew that in-flight conflicts could affect the experience of everyone nearby, and she had successfully managed this delicate situation. Amina felt grateful for her professionalism and for the quiet support she had received, which had allowed her to maintain her peace of mind. Throughout the flight, Amina reflected on the lessons she had learned. She realized that life often presented situations where people tried to push their own desires at the expense of others. Handling these moments with grace, empathy, and patience could prevent conflict while preserving dignity. She thought about how small acts of kindness, like smiling at a disappointed child, could ease tension and maintain a positive atmosphere. The mother occasionally glanced toward Amina, perhaps reflecting on her own approach and recognizing that fairness and empathy were just as important as her child's immediate happiness. The child, though initially disappointed, had adjusted and was now enjoying the flight in his own way. Amina's calm and steady presence had provided a model for handling difficult situations without escalation. As the hours passed, the plane moved steadily toward its destination. The city below, which had seemed so large and bustling at takeoff, was now a distant landscape of roads, buildings, and fields. The clouds outside created a peaceful scene, stretching endlessly in soft white patterns. Amina felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that she had handled the situation without compromise to her own rights or sense of self-respect. The mother, though still slightly reflective, focused on ensuring her child was comfortable and entertained. The child occasionally glanced out the window, now fascinated by the patterns of clouds and the distant landscape. Amina returned her attention to her own experience, watching the sky shift and appreciating the sense of calm that came from standing firm with kindness and patience. By the time the flight attendants began preparing for landing, the mother and child were fully settled. Amina had maintained her peace of mind, and the earlier tension had transformed into a quiet understanding of boundaries and fairness. She reflected on the small but important lessons from this experience: the value of patience, empathy, and clear communication in resolving conflicts, and the importance of standing firm while remaining kind. As the plane descended toward the destination, the city below gradually came into view. Amina smiled softly, thinking about the journey she had taken, not just across the sky but through a moment that tested her patience and composure. She had faced a challenging situation with grace and had emerged with her dignity intact, having demonstrated that fairness, empathy, and calm assertiveness could coexist even in tense moments. The mother adjusted her child for landing, finally seeming fully at ease with the situation. Amina, looking out the window one last time before landing, felt a quiet sense of pride and relief. The experience had taught her more about human behavior, boundaries, and the importance of standing up for oneself respectfully. She knew that this lesson would stay with her long after the flight ended. The plane had reached cruising altitude and most passengers had begun to settle comfortably into their routines. The gentle hum of the engines created a soothing rhythm, and the occasional sound of a seatbelt click or a bag being placed in the overhead compartment added to the steady, familiar atmosphere. Yet near Amina's seat, the quiet tension had not completely disappeared. The mother, still slightly frustrated, continued to glance toward Amina, her child occasionally looking between them with curiosity and confusion. Amina remained composed, maintaining her calm and peaceful demeanor, refusing to let the mother's insistence disrupt her sense of calm. The mother, noticing that her attempts to persuade Amina had not succeeded, decided to escalate her efforts. She straightened in her seat and spoke more firmly, though still attempting to appear polite. "I really don't understand why you can't just switch for a few hours," she said. "It's only for my child. He's been so excited about this window seat. I thought maybe you could be kind and help us." Her voice, while not angry, carried a sense of expectation, as though politeness alone should convince Amina to move. Amina looked at the mother, her expression calm but steady. "I'm sorry, but I cannot move. This is my seat. I booked it for myself and I need to stay here. I hope your child can enjoy another window seat in the future." Her tone was gentle yet firm, reflecting both empathy for the child and a clear understanding of her own rights. She did not waver or display frustration. Instead, she maintained the same composed demeanor that had served her so well throughout the encounter. At that moment, Clara, the flight attendant who had been making her rounds in the cabin, noticed the mother's renewed insistence. Clara was experienced and skilled at managing conflicts without escalating them. She approached Amina's row with a calm, professional presence, giving the impression that she was there to help rather than to judge. She had seen similar situations many times and knew that the best approach was to address the issue firmly, but respectfully. "Hello, Clara said warmly but firmly, addressing both women. I see there's a bit of a disagreement here. Let's take a moment to sort this out. Her voice carried authority but was neutral and friendly. Clara's presence immediately shifted the dynamic in the row. The mother, who had been growing more insistent, paused and turned to face her, realizing that this flight attendant would not let the situation go unchecked. The mother spoke first, her voice polite yet slightly tense. I was hoping my child could sit by the window. He's very excited, and I thought maybe the woman here could switch seats just this once. Her tone carried both pleading and expectation, as though Clara's intervention might finally bring the resolution she wanted. Amina remained calm. I understand, but this is my seat. I booked it and I cannot move. I hope your child will enjoy another window seat. Her tone continued to balance empathy and firmness, showing that she was willing to understand the child's feelings but would not compromise her own rights. Clara nodded thoughtfully, listening carefully to both sides. She then addressed the mother directly, her tone now clear and authoritative. I understand that you want your child to be happy, she said. That is understandable. However, airline rules state that each passenger must stay in their assigned seat. Everyone has the right to the seat they purchased, including this passenger. Clara's words were firm, leaving no room for misunderstanding, but she delivered them in a calm and professional manner. The mother's expression shifted from expectation to surprise. She had assumed that perhaps a polite appeal might persuade someone to give up their seat. Instead, Clara's firm yet fair response made it clear that the rules applied equally to everyone, and that Amina's seat was not negotiable. The mother glanced at her child, who seemed uncertain but gradually returned his attention to his toy. The child's initial disappointment softened as he engaged with something else, and the mother sighed softly, beginning to accept the reality of the situation. Nearby passengers, who had been watching quietly, seemed to relax. A few smiled discreetly at Amina, appreciating her calmness and composure. Others returned to their reading or devices, reassured that the situation had been handled professionally. The presence of Clara, the flight attendant, had diffused the tension and restored order to the cabin. The mother, realizing that further insistence would be futile, adjusted her approach. She focused on making her child comfortable, offering a small snack and engaging him with a toy. The child responded with a faint smile, clearly reassured by his mother's attention and the small distraction. Amina continued to sit calmly in her seat, occasionally offering the child a gentle smile to ease any lingering disappointment. Her quiet composure and Clara's firm support had prevented the situation from escalating further. As the flight continued, Amina reflected on the experience. She realized that handling difficult situations required patience, empathy, and firmness. It was not enough to simply resist. One also had to remain polite, composed, and respectful while standing up for oneself. She thought about the importance of balancing kindness with clear boundaries, and how doing so could prevent unnecessary conflict while preserving one's dignity. The mother occasionally glanced toward Amina, perhaps reflecting on her own behavior and recognizing that her insistence had been misplaced. She adjusted her child in the seat, engaging him with stories and small games to keep him entertained. The child, now content, seemed to have forgotten the initial disappointment, absorbed in the activity his mother provided. Amina, watching quietly, felt a sense of satisfaction that the situation had resolved peacefully and respectfully. Clara made another pass through the cabin, ensuring that all passengers were comfortable and that the atmosphere remained calm. She checked that everyone's seatbelts were fastened, answered questions, and assisted passengers with minor needs. Her professionalism and attentiveness reinforced the importance of rules and fairness, showing that even small conflicts could be managed effectively when addressed with patience and authority. Amina reflected further on the lessons of the encounter. She understood that life often presented situations where people tried to assert their desires at the expense of others. Handling such situations gracefully required both empathy and courage, as well as the ability to communicate clearly and respectfully. By standing firm in her seat while remaining polite, she had demonstrated that fairness and kindness could coexist, even in tense moments. The mother, though still reflective, focused entirely on her child. She adjusted his seatbelt, handed him another snack, and engaged him with small games to ensure he was content. The child responded positively, now more absorbed in the activity than in the earlier conflict. Amina's calm demeanor had provided a subtle model of poise and patience, showing that difficult moments could be navigated without anger or confrontation. As the hours passed, the plane moved steadily toward its destination. The landscape outside shifted from distant clouds to hints of the city below, giving a sense of progress and anticipation. Amina continued to enjoy the view, watching the sunlight glint off the clouds and marveling at the patterns of light and shadow. The mother occasionally glanced at her child, who now seemed fully content and engaged. The tension that had characterized the early part of the flight was now replaced by a quiet sense of resolution and understanding. Amina reflected on the significance of the encounter. She realized that small moments in life often carried important lessons about patience, empathy, and respect. By standing firm and remaining composed, she had not only protected her own space but also modeled respectful behavior for those around her. Clara's intervention had reinforced the fairness of the situation, demonstrating that rules and boundaries exist for everyone's benefit, and that authority, when applied respectfully, can prevent unnecessary conflict. By the time the plane began preparations for landing, the mother and her child were fully comfortable. Amina had maintained her seat, preserved her dignity, and observed how empathy and patience could guide human interactions. The flight attendant had ensured that the rules were respected, and the passengers around them had witnessed a clear example of fairness and composure in action. As the city below came into view, Amina felt a quiet sense of pride. She had navigated a challenging situation with grace and patience, maintaining her rights while showing empathy for a child and understanding for a parent. The mother, now fully focused on her child, seemed to have learned a subtle but important lesson about boundaries, fairness, and the limits of insistence. The child, meanwhile, had found comfort and engagement in his own way, no longer upset or distracted by the earlier tension. The plane descended gently, the engine's hum shifting slightly as the aircraft prepared for landing. Amina looked out the window, watching the city grow closer and appreciating the calm sense of satisfaction that comes from resolving conflict peacefully. The experience had taught her not only about patience and composure, but also about the subtle ways in which empathy and respect can influence human interactions. By the time the plane touched down, the mother and child were fully engaged in their own world, the tension of the earlier confrontation entirely behind them. As the plane touched down smoothly and taxied toward the gate, the cabin buzzed with the familiar sounds of passengers gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. The gentle hum of conversation and the clatter of rolling suitcases created a sense of motion and anticipation. Amina adjusted her bag on her lap, taking a deep breath and reflecting on the experience she had just navigated. It had been a journey not only across the sky, but through a moment that tested her patience, composure, and ability to stand firm while remaining kind. The mother, seated across the aisle, had shifted her focus entirely to her child. The earlier insistence and frustration had faded, replaced by quiet attentiveness and care. She adjusted the child's seatbelt, handed him a small toy, and engaged him in a soft conversation to ensure he remained calm and comfortable. The child, now more content, occasionally glanced out the window but was primarily absorbed in the games and stories his mother offered. The tension that had hung over the row for much of the flight had dissipated, replaced by a sense of quiet resolution. Amina allowed herself a small smile. She felt a sense of quiet satisfaction at how the situation had been handled. She had maintained her seat, preserved her dignity, and done so with patience and composure. More than that, she had observed the power of empathy and kindness in even the most challenging moments. Her calm demeanor had helped ease the child's disappointment and had allowed the mother to shift her focus from insistence to care. It was a reminder that standing firm did not have to come at the expense of compassion. As the plane approached the gate, the flight attendants began their final preparations for landing. Clara, the attendant who had intervened earlier, walked past Amina and offered a warm, discreet smile of acknowledgement. It was a small gesture, but it carried reassurance and recognition. Clara's support had been crucial in reinforcing the fairness of the situation and ensuring that the rules were applied respectfully and clearly. Amina appreciated the professionalism and care that had been shown, understanding how important it was for staff to manage moments like these calmly and effectively. Passengers began to gather their belongings, and the subtle murmur of voices filled the cabin. Amina adjusted her bag, checked that she had everything she needed, and allowed herself a moment to reflect on what had transpired. She realized that while the situation might have seemed small to an outside observer, it held important lessons about boundaries, fairness, and human interaction. In moments of conflict, maintaining calm, empathy, and clarity could transform what might have been a stressful experience into a lesson in respect and dignity. The mother, now fully focused on her child, leaned forward slightly to gather their belongings. She spoke softly to the child, reassuring him and preparing him for the process of leaving the plane. The child, now smiling faintly, responded with curiosity and excitement, no longer affected by the earlier disappointment. Amina watched quietly, feeling a sense of satisfaction in how everyone had handled the situation. The resolution had been peaceful, respectful, and fair, demonstrating the power of patience and understanding. As the plane came to a complete stop at the gate, passengers began the orderly process of disembarking. Amina waited her turn, allowing those in front to move first. She observed the interactions around her and noticed subtle expressions of acknowledgement and appreciation from other passengers. Some smiled discreetly, perhaps recognizing her composure and the way she had handled the situation. Others returned to their conversations, but the calmness she exuded seemed to have left a gentle mark on the surrounding atmosphere. The mother and child gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the plane. She offered a small nod of acknowledgement toward Amina, a silent gesture that conveyed a mix of respect and reflection. There were no words exchanged, but the gesture carried meaning. The mother had experienced a moment of realization that her insistence could not override another person's rights, and she had shifted her approach accordingly. Amina returned the nod with a warm, gentle smile, affirming the unspoken understanding that had developed between them. As passengers moved down the aisle, Amina continued to reflect on the experience. She considered how often life presents challenges that test our patience and integrity. In moments of tension, it is easy to react impulsively or allow frustration to dictate behavior. Yet, by remaining calm, empathetic, and respectful, she had navigated the situation successfully. She had shown that fairness, kindness, and firmness could coexist, even in a tense moment where expectations and desires clashed. The child, now fully engaged in a small story his mother was telling, glanced occasionally at the window with curiosity, but no longer expressed disappointment. Amina observed this quietly, recognizing the subtle impact her composure had had on the child. By remaining calm and kind, she had allowed the child to feel reassured without giving in to the mother's repeated demands. It was a small but meaningful reminder of how behavior, even in stressful situations, can influence and ease the experiences of others. As the plane's doors opened and the fresh air of the terminal wafted in, Amina gathered her carry-on and laptop bag. She moved with quiet confidence, navigating through the passengers with a sense of calm and purpose. The mother and child were ahead, continuing toward the exit, and Amina felt a quiet sense of closure. The situation that had begun as a source of tension had ended with understanding, respect, and dignity intact for all parties involved. Walking down the jet bridge and into the terminal, Amina reflected on the lessons learned. Standing firm, she realized, was not about asserting dominance or creating conflict. It was about understanding one's own rights, communicating them clearly and respectfully, and maintaining patience in the face of pressure. Equally important was the role of empathy, acknowledging the feelings of others without compromising one's own boundaries. In this case, her calm demeanor had reassured the child and had helped the mother recognize the importance of fairness. The mother, now fully engaged in guiding her child through the terminal, occasionally glanced back toward Amina, a subtle but meaningful acknowledgement of the encounter. Amina returned a quiet smile, feeling that a mutual understanding had been reached. There were no words exchanged, but the shared experience had conveyed important lessons to both women. The mother had learned about patience, boundaries, and fairness, while Amina had strengthened her confidence in handling challenging situations with grace. As Amina walked toward the baggage claim, she continued to reflect on the subtle ways in which human interactions shape experiences. Small gestures, a smile, a calm tone, a respectful boundary could have powerful effects. The encounter on the plane had been a microcosm of life itself, demonstrating how composure, empathy, and clarity could transform potential conflict into a meaningful lesson. It was a reminder that standing up for oneself did not have to come at the expense of kindness or understanding. Reaching the baggage claim, Amina retrieved her suitcase and adjusted her bag on her shoulder. She noticed other travelers moving about, some looking tired, some cheerful, each carrying their own stories and experiences. The memory of the interaction on the plane stayed with her, a quiet reminder of the importance of fairness, empathy, and patience. She felt proud of herself for handling the situation with dignity and for maintaining her composure throughout the flight. The mother and child had already moved past the claim area. Navigating toward the exit, Amina watched them from a distance, noting the child's cheerful demeanor and the mother's attentive care. She realized that moments of tension, when handled correctly, could leave lasting impressions and teach lessons that extend beyond the immediate situation. The encounter had reinforced her understanding of human behavior, empathy, and the importance of respecting boundaries. As she walked toward the terminal exit, Amina thought about how often similar situations occurred in everyday life, whether on public transportation, in offices, or in social settings. The principles she had applied, calmness, empathy, clarity, and firmness, were universally valuable. She understood that respecting others' rights while maintaining one's own was essential to healthy interactions, and that kindness and composure often diffuse tension better than confrontation or anger. Stepping out of the terminal into the fresh air, Amina felt a sense of relief and accomplishment. The flight had been smooth, not only in terms of travel but in how she had navigated the social dynamics of the encounter. She felt empowered by her ability to remain calm, empathetic, and assertive, recognizing that these qualities had allowed her to handle a challenging situation successfully. It was a small but meaningful victory, a reminder that patience and understanding often carry the most significant impact. As she moved toward the taxi stand, Amina reflected on the lessons she would carry with her. She had learned that firmness and kindness could coexist, that empathy could ease tension, and that respecting boundaries was crucial in any social situation. She had demonstrated courage not through aggression or confrontation, but through calm, thoughtful action. These insights, she realized, were as valuable as the journey itself. The mother and child, now a short distance ahead, continued their way toward the exit.